I'm a senior product specialist with the Telos Alliance. And the Telos Alliance is a number of brands. I hope I get it right. 7 different brands. So Linear Acoustic is a brand of the Telos Alliance. Minnetonka Audio is a brand. There's Axia. There's the Telos telephone products. There's the Omnia processors, and there's 25/7, which makes time stretching and time compression devices, hence the 25/7 in the name. So that's 6 companies. That sounds right to me. 6 brands within the Telos Alliance. So when I started, I actually went to work for Linear Acoustic, but I went to work for Linear Acoustic literally weeks from them becoming part of the Telos Alliance. And Minnetonka became a part. And so we have one large engineering group, and that engineering group is over all the products, and to the greatest extent possible, we leverage the experience of Axia with audio over IP. That goes back to 2001 when we introduced Livewire, and 2002 when Livewire was actually released. It was released a year before PTP was basically developed and released as part of the Internet Task Force's an IEEE run out of a way to get much, much higher accuracy on the networks. And so before that existed, we developed our own timing, which is Livewire Clock. And a number of years ago, it's got to be 5 years ago now, we started to move all of the Axia products, everything that was Livewire, and move that to Livewire Plus. And the Plus there is AES67. So on the TV side, you have a lot of devices that are AES67 and SMPTE-2110-30 and 31 compliant, while having a backward compatibility on the radio side of the Livewire installations, which I think at this point number more than 10,000 consoles out in the world. And on the other side, the radio products are also becoming AES67/2110-30 compliant. Basically, as all the products are refreshed or new products are developed, they're developed with AES67 compliance or compatibility. So you have a group that has radio, of a long, long history in radio, and that is the Axia, Omnia part of the companies, and the Telos part of the company. You have Linear Acoustic and Minnetonka, who have both been involved in audio, but mostly on the television side. And then you have 25/7, which was added to the collection of radio products. And somewhere in there are also the range of Voltaire products, which is something that were developed, a line that was developed inside our labs to give a prediction of the carriage, I'll say, of Nielsen and Arbitron codes. In other words, how much of your audience measurement tagging is actually getting through the air chain. And so some people may or may not know Voltaire, but in the radio space, it is pretty well known. A very niche and specialty product that has a lot of users. So that's sort of a brief on who the Telos Alliance is. The company itself goes back into the 1980s. Steve Church, if anybody remembers that name, developed the very first digital telephony processor. He's the first one that applied digital technology to the transformer hybrid that everybody used to get callers on the air, and created that as a completely digitally derived hybrid. So that whole class of products that was Telos was Steve Church. And on the other side, for digital development, Omnia, at the time called Vigilante, Frank Foti had a company. That side of the company started to apply digital technology to radio processing. And then Steve and Frank Foti got together. That became the Telos Alliance. So that was Telos and Omnia, which is what the Vigilante processors became. And then all the other products came up, and all the other branding came up, and all the other companies joined together. We may be one of the few companies that's in broadcast that is strictly an audio company. All of our expertise is in audio. Our video expertise has been extended by necessity into the ability to de-embed and re-embed audio channels. But all of our experience with Dolby, and we are a certified Dolby partner, that all comes from our ability to get the audio in and out of video. But we don't directly handle video. Delay it, take audio out of it, put audio into it. So that's the scope of the things that we do. The COM Act, this goes back to 2010, and even has a little bit of history with our founder, a guy named Tim Carroll, who came from Dolby. Dolby does not want to make hardware, and they did not want to make hardware at the end of the 1990s. And Tim, who worked for them, wanted to do hardware. He wanted to do a processor. Dolby had been working with digital audio, and they were heavily involved in the run-up to the ATSC-1, the first spec for digital TV. And Tim knew that it was not going to be possible to use analog processing to process digital audio and fit it down a TV channel. And so he left Dolby and started Linear Acoustic. And Linear Acoustic was actually supposed to be a joke, putting together two words that don't really go together very well. But in any case, that's where all the aero processing came from. The first one of those was released in 2001. So we come by our knowledge and our concern with the COM Act in particular, with fitting audio into the TV channel properly for viewers. We come by that really honestly, and from somebody who came from years and years at Dolby. I'll get into some of that later, and you'll see this, I hope, is a good mix between the legalese of the FCC R&O and some of the art and science of audio. So with that, as a very long introduction, we are going to jump right in to the FCC Report and Order 11-182. This report and order, this is what created the COM Act. And I have just a couple of things directly out of the FCC report and order. The law, the numbers here are the paragraphs. It is very easy to find this R&O online, but at the end of a few slides, I'll give you a couple of addresses, URLs where you can pick some of this stuff up. So the first thing that the FCC says in the very first paragraph is designed to prevent digital television commercial advertisements from being transmitted at louder volumes than the program material they accompany. The very first paragraph. So the object here was to make commercials and the program appear at the same volume. In the third paragraph, there's actually two interesting things in this. The FCC did not do an engineering study and independently come up with some engineering rules for stations to follow. Instead, the FCC looked at the ATSC recommendations themselves. A85 is the audio recommendation by the ATSC-1 committee. The ATSC committee was made up of broadcasters, that's over-the-air broadcasters, cable broadcasters, companies like HBO or AMC, companies that were involved in producing content for TV. They were all involved in the ATSC development. And so the A85 was part of that. The FCC said, we are going to make the ATSCs, the industry's recommendations, part of this order. In other words, you have to follow the rules that you as broadcasters invented. And they also said it only applies to digital services and not to analog services. And in a minute, you'll see why that's important and how that came to be. Compliance with this requires the industry to use the ITUR recommendation of Broadcast Standard 1770. So there was an international effort to come up with a meter which was a perceptual audio meter. For anybody in this group who mixes, you may have long ago realized that how loud something sounds does not always match what a VU meter or a peak meter tells you. You can have things that have a reading around your zero, your target point, and some of those can sound much louder or much softer than others, and that depends on what the content is, depends on the density of the content, it depends on what kind of processing you may be using. And so the International Telecommunications Union did a study that lasted many years and came up with a new metering standard. And we'll talk about that a little while longer. The FCC, in making this rule, automatically attaches any revisions of A85 and any revisions of 1770 are automatically part of this rule. So as the number of channels grows, as the metering gets better, it's all automatically part of this. And then they have something that the FCC calls the golden rule. They call it that right inside this requirement. And it's that the dial norm must identify the loudness of the content it accompanies. And this dial norm, this comes right out of Dolby. This dial norm is a Dolby concept. And this is what dial norm is about. So the AC3, which a lot of people will know, that term AC3 is used in a lot of devices. It is really a shorthand that Dolby never really meant to be used by people outside of Dolby as the bitrate compression algorithm that was being used. They wanted that to be called Dolby Digital. That is the official name of this bitrate reduction. And Dolby Digital, in addition to doing some bitrate reduction to carry audio efficiently across the TV channel, also carries 5.1 channel sound with proper alignment of the 6 channels. So it's the 5 surround channels plus the LFE channel. So it was the two things that AC3 did. It made the bit rate of 6 channels of audio lower, and it guaranteed that the 6 channels would be in alignment, and that alignment is down to the sample. But there's other things in that, and one of the things that's in that is dial norm data and their dynamic range and compression metadata. If you had cable TV or had set-top boxes, even back in analog, you might have gone in there and seen that you could choose to have an RF profile for the output of your set-top box, where if you use the RF output of the box, you used an RF profile for the audio. But if you use the RCA connectors out of the box, that you could choose to use the line output. And the difference between those is that there was metadata that was sent that controlled the dynamic range and compression information in the DRC, the dynamic range control in the Dolby decoders in every box, that told it whether it needed to compress for an RF channel or allow wide dynamic range without compression for a hi-fi channel. This is completely in the Dolby world. If you are in an ATSC 1 country, every TV must have the Dolby decoder chip in it. All the audio, mono, stereo, 5.1, all of it is AC3 encoded. Nothing goes over the air except AC3. And all of the AC3 goes through a demux that looks like this. So this is the audio section. From the antenna, there is a a demuxer, there's a separate diagram for the video, but the audio comes down. First thing it does is it hits the Dolby Digital Plus decoder. Dolby Digital Plus includes both Dolby Digital decoding and Dolby Digital Plus decoding. By the time ATSC1 went on the air, there was already Dolby Digital Plus, which has some additional compression. It can handle additional channels, but the AC3 that we're all familiar with is encompassed within DD+. And from your transmitter, from your audio encoder at the studio side, you put in a dial norm value. And that goes and hits a 5-bit audio attenuator. And I won't make you do the binary math. That's 32 steps. So before the volume control that the consumer has in his remote or at his fingertips on the TV, there is a 31-step attenuator, and that's built into the decoder. And the object of that is, if you target your dialogue to be at -24 below full scale, then you say, my normal dialogue, my dial norm here is going to be -24. The 5-bit attenuator reads that, and it gives 7 dB of negative gain. In other words, the output for everybody is -31 dB into the DRC, into the dynamic range control. If your level is higher than -31, if your dial norm, for instance, is -24, then that 24 dB subtracts 7. If you are, I believe PBS is still at -27. Even today, they put in a dial norm of -27, and they only have a 4 dB attenuation before the DRC. The result of that is when you turn from NBC or ABC and you switch the channel to PBS, there's not a change in the level, because no matter how the programs are delivered and how they're produced, if your normal is 27, then you just send out -27. You apply the DRC, comes out the same as people who use -24. So that's the 5-bit attenuator. The dynamic range and compression metadata, that can also be sent. That's usually just set in your Dolby encoder, and that tells the DRC whether you want to force the DRC to an RF output, which is a compressed lower dynamic range output, or put that at there's actually a setting for music and there's a setting for line. There's a few settings in it, but the common one that almost everybody uses is the line setting, and then it goes to the output. So the dial norm that you're setting that has to be correct for the content that you send out, this is what it does. It's the single most important thing that drives how the COM Act works. There were attempts by some people early on to change the dial norm data with the content. If it came out of your newsroom, maybe the normal level was -18, not -24, just owing to the console that you used. Maybe if it came from Hollywood, where -31 is a norm, that you would change it to -31. So in other words, you had information that was serial information that traveled along with your video and audio essence, and it changed it. As the program was played, it was loaded into your Dolby encoder. The problem that was found universally is that if there was a break in that serial data chain, if the dial norm got separated from the essence, then it was wrong. And that did not work well. And so what everybody did was just determine, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say everything coming out of my plant is at -24. So my dial norm is -24. And then they used a device, even before the COM Act, they used something like one of our arrows, and they used the arrow to set that output level. So the arrow looked at what was coming in, metered that, looked at what you set the output target to be, and then adjusted the input audio to be the correct level at the output. And that was the essence of the control that was required for the COM Act. We had literally hundreds of phone calls when the COM Act was going into effect, where people were saying, what do we need to do? And the answer was, you need to get a meter that is an ITU 1770 meter so that you can see what your levels are. And you just have to make sure that the level that you see on the meter matches the level that you're sending out as dial norm metadata. Does that make sense to everybody? Does that raise questions, or does that clear some things up? Feel free.
Yeah, it's a little bit tough to grasp when we talk about how, say, a PBS station might use minus 27 for their dial norm, and maybe the commercial stations are using minus 24. When we switch channels between or among them, the perceived audio level to the viewer is the same. I'm going to have to think about that and try and get my head around that.
Right, and you know, sounds the same. There's a good bit of variation due to other issues, but PBS, like Hollywood, like film production, nobody in that world likes to push the audio levels where they don't have a huge amount of headroom, because it's very expensive to do retakes because of audio distortion. And so even back in analog, it was not unusual in the movie industry to target a soundtrack at minus 31, so that there was always plenty of headroom. It may be pushed onto an optical soundtrack for a movie at a higher level because of the noise level of optical soundtracks, but when you're doing the takes and when you're collecting the film or when you're building the mix, you couldn't build a mix that extended beyond the headroom of an analog board. And so by having multiple channels at a low level, you were able to mix together 12, 24, 48 tracks of film sound. So it's all the Foley and all of the music and all of the dialogue and all of the other effects. It always kept it low. My observation of PBS production is it's just like film production. We can't do this over and over again. So we're going to produce at a slightly lower level and pull it up. Whereas the major US networks, the mainstay of their business is their news studio. And even if they're high end, and I'll get a little bit into levels in a minute, even if they're at the high end, they need to keep the signal to noise ratio good. And so they're going to be pushing perhaps 20 dB of headroom, perhaps even 16 dB of headroom or less, because it's live, it goes directly out on the air, they need to keep the noise down, so they're pushing the levels harder. What dial norm does is allow all of this to come out at whatever prescribed level that you want. So you control it going into the transmitter, and now this dial norm can't be separated from the essence, because the dial norm is part of the Dolby soundtrack. It arrives with the Dolby encoded audio. So those two things are married in the transmission path. Just for a minute, some specifics of what A85 means. So A85 is the ATSC part of the recommendation. Also very easy to find, and it's all of these things are available. There's no charge and there's no logins. You can find all this stuff online. There's some definitions to know. The anchor element. So the way A85 is actually specified, the anchor element, and you can think of that in news, it's going to be the news anchors. It's where anchor element came from, as well as it's the anchor of the audio program. If it's music, then it may be the vocals in the music. If it's a movie, it's likely to be the dialogue in the movie. Whatever a reasonable person would adjust their volume control for, that's the anchor element. The anchor element has to be at the same level as commercials. That's the idea. You set the anchor element to your target LKFS. I'm going to put in LUFS. I think here's the only place. Loudness, K scale relative to full scale, loudness unit full scale, LUFS is used everywhere outside of North America. LKFS is used in North America. It has the same value. It means the same thing. LUFS conforms to the international standard for technical naming, and LKFS is just what we thought we'd call it here in the US. If you can't isolate the anchor element, welcome to being a broadcaster. You get finished programs unless you're doing live news. You have to set the integrated level of the product, of the whole audio product, to the target LKFS level. If it's under 3 minutes long, there is no anchor element. There is only the integration over the entire piece of audio, and that's your level. And that has to be plus or minus 2 dB. So these are important definitions to know if you're trying to set up processing or production with metering to get to a certain goal. So I'll just throw these in here. I can, of course, give you this whole presentation, and you can distribute this or any way that you want. The only thing you have to know is the current version is FCC 11-182A1. You can just do a search for FCC 182A1, and you'll find that document. It would be very interesting for any broadcaster to go to FCC volume complaints, because there is a form that you have to fill out in order to register a complaint about TV volume. And you should see the amount of detail that's required in that form. It is not a phone call to your local office. It's not a letter that says the serial ads are loud on WXYZ. It's this ad on this station at this date at this time was loud. And if you're on cable, it has to be this commercial at this time on this station on this cable company. You have to have all that information before this form is acceptable to the FCC. So there's some detail. People who are making complaints that are registered by the FCC, they're going through something to make that complaint. It's not an easy spur of the moment, I think I'll complain kind of thing. You have to really want to do it. Also, for the record, there are lots of standards around the world. They all revolve around ATSC A85 and the European Broadcast Union R128 standard. Everything else in the world relied on those two standards. Yeah, Italy even came up with their own, even though they're part of Europe, which is slightly different than the EBU standard. But having standards for this is just the way it is in a digital television world, and all for the same reason. I will tell you, now I don't expect you guys to read this at all, but every year the FCC sends a letter to Congresswoman Eshoo of California, who was the driving force behind the COM Act to begin with. And the FCC tells her what the status of the COM Act is for the past year. So I can tell you that there's never been a monetary fine levied by the FCC against any broadcaster. I can also tell you that the FCC talks to several broadcasters every year. There's something ongoing all the time where the FCC is investigating what is going on due to user complaints. So the user complaints have to be about a particular station and show the FCC that there is a willful desire to not obey the COM Act. It has to be repeated by the broadcaster, and it has to be shown to be a pattern with the broadcaster before they're involved. The FCC will accept that our broadcaster is trying if they have installed equipment to maintain the levels, if that equipment is properly configured and that equipment is maintained. And the evidence for that would be that they could pull a log of any week It can't be a week in the past. It's always a week in the future. So if the FCC comes, they will say, we want to see a log for the week of whatever, and that will be some point in the future. And you have an amount of time to get them that log. Given that, they will examine that log and see if there is a regular, if there's regular levels that are outside of the restrictions of the COM Act. And in that case, they'll talk to you. But so far, that has not been the case. Every broadcaster question has demonstrated that they're making a good faith effort to try and make this work. So let's talk a little bit about the problem. A small window of tolerance equals frequent complaints from viewers. I think that especially when digital went on the air, we all know how frequent those complaints were. I can tell you for the very large companies that I'm frequently involved with, it is really hard to find a phone number for, and I'll just imagine that you want to call Mr. HBO, AMC, National Geographic. Just think of a channel you watch and then try and find a phone number to get into engineering at that station to ask a question. So when people complain, they've really, really worked hard to complain. And I will tell you that everybody hears complaints. And they have to sort out whether they're real or not real. They pull logs on their own. They try and figure out what's going on. Once the FCC made this an order, it became a regulation. No broadcaster wants to be involved in the FCC. Everybody wants to avoid FCC involvement. And I say, and improve the listener experience. Honestly, we all know that the listener experience comes second to not being fined or being involved with the FCC. There isn't any company that wants to have a black mark with the FCC on them. So there's two things that happen in here. One is I don't want to do something that gets the government involved. And number two, if my listeners are happy, viewers are happy, that's a great thing. And the issue is overreaction. So we're 10 years past when this started. And I will tell you that we still have users of our arrows which are using processing from 2012 and 2013, when nobody in the world of commercial production knew what this was. They're still using things that have very heavy compression and a lot of limiting, which is no longer really necessary in a lot of cases. And the problem with that is that will now start to get complaints from advertisers and program producers because things don't sound on the air like they sounded in production, when in fact the producers are measuring for compliance with the COM Act. Let's get into some science and some art and talk about how we got here. Analog, for those of you who remember it, right? We had 8 octaves. We were supposed to have a 60 dB dynamic range, or I would better to say a noise level that was below 60 dB. I think in practice in TV, you're lucky to get 50, and I will give you some examples of why that's true. And we had mono or stereo. We also had TVs in relatively large boxes that could have kind of bigger speakers. At least they were had magnets bigger than your thumbnail, and they had a box behind them to actually produce a little bit of bass. So what we have now with Dolby Digital or Dolby AC3 is we now have 10 octaves of range. There is really the ability to deliver 120 dB or better dynamic range. If you're delivering 24-bit, that is 144 dB noise floor. So whether your production is that quiet that your silence goes down to 144 dB, it is, except in labs designed to do this, impossible to measure. So there is no noise in this broadcast channel. Distortion that's listed in most, Sony, Toshiba high-end TVs with 20-watt amplifiers. Most of those are reporting a 0.5% or less distortion. If you have a home theater system, I have a $200 Sony surround receiver with 0.1% distortion. So very, very low and mono through 5.1 channels. And here you have a flat screen TV where the speakers in that TV are not going to be deeper than an inch. And then you have a home theater system, a 5.1 system with an LFE surround. And so we have come from, even though I loved hi-fi in the 70s, we have come a huge leap forward. Dolby did some research. They actually had people come into a room that was set up like a living room. They gave people a volume control and they played them content. And the person could adjust the content on the first piece. Then they took the adjustment away and you had a pad of paper and they would give you things to listen to and you could mark them on this scale. Now the comfort zone is something that Dolby added afterwards. They said the comfort zone was that range between where people went, this is okay, or it was soft, it was okay. Internally, for me and for the way we operate with our processors, we think the comfort zone is between turn it down and turn it up. Until the user is going to reach for the volume control, you're safe. And so you can go toward that limit. And that limit, if you look at it, is roughly 16 dB, 15.8 from the center, so give or take. So let's take that and look at what we did with analog audio and TV, right? TV audio is FM. So in FM modulation, if we were looking at our VU meter, around 0 VU that's where we tried to put the bulk of our content. We tried to average around 0, and above 0, depending on the console you own, it could go to plus 18, could go to plus 20, could go to plus 24. You had a little bit of headroom. And certainly, even a mediocre console could reach somewhere near minus 50 as a noise floor. But look at what we did with modulation. From 100% to 50% is a 6 dB drop. So our limiters only gave you 6 dB of headroom over that average. And your average levels were somewhere between that 0 dB and maybe a little lower. So on a VU, you had 10 dB below 0 on that meter, and most people tried to keep it like within the top 4 or 5. So from 50% to 25%, which is only 6 dB, and then below that was what we called quiet. So think about this. When you did a proof of performance measurement, at 100% modulation, you could get to 15K in frequency response, and your distortion would have to be under, I think it was under 1%. By the time you got to 25% modulation, it was okay to have over 3% distortion, and you didn't have to go above 10K to get it. So look at how small that range of modulation was, how little we delivered to the viewer. Now let's go to this, right? So here's my idea of where that comfort, where that allowable zone is. And now look what happens when you put those together. So this is what we've been delivering to viewers. We have, for 50 years, delivered viewers a range between 100% and roughly 18 or 20% modulation. That's where all of our content was. So is it any wonder that going back here, that this is what users are used to, and this is where users' limits are? It is also an explanation of why there weren't that many complaints about commercials in analog. Yes, we had them. Yes, some commercials were absolutely agonizingly loud because you could compress them so there was only 2 dB peak to average, and that would be really annoying. But in analog, it was very difficult to crank that up. So let's look at audio production today. So peak meter on the left side, VU meter on the right side. So when we're talking about production in a digital console, we're talking about production that could easily reach plus 24 and can easily go down to minus 72. And even in an older analog console, you had a pretty good range. But now, let's say I was looking for a label. The meter on the left is the production range, and the meter on the right is commercial range. So if I'm going to be aggressive with a commercial, I may crank up the compressor, and I may get the average close to plus 6 or plus 8, and I may have those peaks squeezed down to 6 dB or less. And now let's compare that to a movie, which is on, where the movie level is coming in not at plus 4, but the movie level's coming in at 0, or perhaps at minus 4 or minus 8. It's possible to deliver to a TV today a commercial where the average of that commercial is 6 dB to 10 dB above the program that's on. Now, even if it's not the main program content, think of any drama with the fade out music and the commercial that comes on after it. So you have a fade that's going down toward minus 24 to a very low level, and the commercial hits, full on average at plus 4 or plus 5. You could have a jump in that transition of more than 20 dB. And that's going to sound horrible to viewers. So let's have a look at what that acceptance zone is put across a modern digital meter and what the object is. The object is to take that large range of production content and that smaller range but louder of commercial content, and to bring those down so that the average of the commercial and that dialogue that you're trying to go for in the program is at the same level. So yes, you're going to fade out. That fade out is going to go down below 36, and you're going to jump into a hot commercial. But in reality, that commercial is going to sound louder compared to the fade, but it's not going to be any louder than the program it was in. And that's the goal, and that's what the FCC is looking for. The FCC is looking for those short-term things to not average higher than where your core dialogue is in your news, your dramas, your public affairs programming, your syndicated programming, and your network programming. How is this measured? So loudness is subjective. It's what I was talking about when I said you can have a VU meter at 0 for 2 pieces, and one will sound much louder than another. There were VU meters. That's a European EBU peak program meter. We have now vertical peak over program level meters. What was found is that if you start to really throw away the content under 100 hertz, and you give extra weight to the content that's above 1 kilohertz, and then you measure, you take samples and measure those samples of audio, that you get a meter which measures level with a K weighting, and that meter relative to full scale matches really, really well with people's perception of loudness. And the difference here is that it's integrated over time. The longer you use an LKFS meter, the longer you look at the signal, the more accurate the reading becomes. So the smallest increment that you can get in these meters is 400 milliseconds. But the suggestion for metering is to meter out around 3 seconds, so that every second the meter is updated with the last 3 seconds. So it's a rolling average. So you're constantly reevaluating and constantly showing an average over the last 3 seconds or so. And that becomes a very good representation of levels. Real quick slide here, just to get into your mind that there is production in a newsroom totally under your control. There is field production, particularly for news, which is totally out of your control. There's selling cereal and soap boxes, which is under somebody else's control. And then there's that huge mix of sources that come from all over the world. All of those things come into your plant, some of them just in time for air. And this is where an inline, online audio level management system becomes critical. For us, we believe the problem that stations face is fidelity versus compliance. The networks are providing great programs. I have heard really good audio out of local newsrooms. And when I say local newsrooms, there's over 1,700 television stations in the US. If you take most of what's done in PBS stations and all of what's done in major market stations and a lot of what's done by some of the larger companies, local stations produce really good audio. And to mash that in order, because of a fear of compliance, because they feel that's what they need to do, or to take a movie and apply huge amounts of limiting compression to that when it's not necessary, that doesn't make for a good experience for viewers. And so the thing here is, how do you balance those two things? It's really easy to make a meter compliant. You can go back in time and get an old Orban analog unit or old Texar prisms or anything that was your favorite processor back in the day, and you can produce a compliant output. Using those devices, it's really hard to do that without making it sound horrible, because those devices didn't know about a target. Those devices couldn't level to a center point and allow limiting and compression only where it was needed. All of those old devices pushed the level up toward the 100% limit, right? There was a hard limit due to the requirement that you not frequency modulate outside of your given channel or you'd interfere with your neighbor. So those things all push things up against a hard top. The new version of that, the things that, for instance, we do with Aero, that is to look at the average levels coming in, to use some intelligence, which tries to pick out the dialogue from that, and then tries to use that intelligence to move that level to the correct level to match your dial norm. And limiting is for protection, so you don't overrun the limit of your encoder. And compression is only used to try and maintain that center where you need it. And we try and allow soft things to get soft, because you do have all of the all of the noise floor that you could possibly want in a digital device.
So Ken, we have a question coming from the chat room.
Sure.
It says, when a viewer files a complaint, where does the FCC Media Bureau start the investigation? Is it with the MVPD, the broadcast affiliate, or the network? Any sense of that?
Well, yes, absolutely. If the viewer has said it's WXYZ in Kansas, then the FCC starts with WXYZ. In that process, immediately one of the things that falls out is if the station says that address is outside of our over-the-air signal, that address is covered by, you know, this cable company or that cable company or whatever, that's probably not off air, then the FCC has to extend to the MPVD. But they will first ask the station the basic questions that I started with a while ago, which is, do you have a loudness processor in line? When was the last time that you did maintenance on that? What is your dial norm? And additionally, can you get me a log? And that log is not just for that commercial in that time slot. That log is going to be a 24/7, usually for a week, that you will hand them. So given that the station shows that, yeah, I mean, you know, I would say, since no one has ever been fined, if you can return to the FCC, here's the make, model, brand, serial number of the device. We do routine maintenance. We log our things regularly, And yes, we can do a log in the future, but here's a log from the week that you mentioned because we happen to save those. And we've looked at this and there's nothing unusual about it. You're not required to save those logs. You're not required to provide them. That's nowhere. But if you're proactive, and lots of stations keep those logs, and you look at that and you go, yeah, it was a little loud. You know, if this week shows that we are absolutely in, the FCC may, if they think that there's still validity in the complaint, go to the MPVD, but the station is no longer, the station's demonstrated what they need. I think the rule for all the stations is only provide precisely what you're asked for and not a thing more. You know, that's up to the station and the station's legal counsel. The FCC starts with where the complaint starts. If it starts with an MPVD, like, well, I saw this on this cable company, this station, they'll start with the cable company.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting, folks, is that when I was working with Ken on an Aero product that we purchased, and Ken was helping us set up when moving into our new building last summer. We use several different brands of transport stream analyzers, and what's really fun is those analyzers do have the ability to analyze the audio as well as the other elements of the transport stream. And they will show you the dial norm, and you can actually, in this case, tell it, I want my sample, I want it to be over this amount of time. So you can make it short, you can make it long. But it was kind of fun to use a second-party device to monitor, measure the output of the Aero product in this case, and see how well that application coming through the Aero actually looked like within the transport stream. And so that's been kind of fun. I've showed it to a few other engineers and said, you know, we never really paid attention to our transport stream analyzers before to know that was in there, right? So that was kind of fun to have that independent, if you will, measuring and monitoring capability.
Right. And by the way, the requirement for the FCC is that anything that you give them as a log comes from a receiver that's receiving from on air. You can't tell them what's going out. You have to tell them what's coming back.
What's coming in? Yeah, got it. Understood.
Because
in our case, we were again, and our transport stream analyzers have both RF input coming from the off-air signal, as well as in this case, an ASI input when you're looking at the transport stream outbound.
Yeah, and the important thing about that is that when you get it on the receive side, you get to see what dial norm is being delivered, as opposed to which one you say you're targeting. So here's what I'm targeting, and here you can see on the receive that's what I'm getting.
What other questions do we have from the room?
I've got one that I threw up in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and say it verbally. With over-the-top services not really being under FCC control, and now we're getting ad-supported over-the-top services, is this going to become an issue there, or are the people who are putting those out, are they voluntarily adhering to these types of standards?
All of the majors are voluntarily doing their best to come up with a standard. Now, the thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. So I know that there are published standards, and internally there are file-based devices which take all of the ingest for everything that goes out on, and I'm just going to pick a few, everything that goes out on Netflix, everything that goes out on Apple TV. I know those in particular. Those things are ingested and they go through a software process for QC, and that QC includes dial norm. Now, whether they're getting that right or not, and how they're interpreting it may be a little bit different from broadcasters because they're not under the FCC. So far, there's nobody that's going to come and talk to them about getting it wrong. And what I mean by that is broadcast seems to pretty much take to heart the part of the requirement that says dialogue has to be at -24. And if I can't get at the dialogue level, then I'm going to have to just take the whole block of program and make that program average -24. What's happening that I measure and that I see on some of the over-the-top services is that their average is -24, but their dialogues could be as low as -31, -30. And the reason for that is that they produce like film. And in film, when you go to the movies, you see you've got a really, really nice speaker system. And that center channel at the theater is big enough so that you always hear the dialogue. And also in a theater, I measure on my phone, the dB meter on my phone, theaters are close to 90, a lot of them. And that's never happening in your living room. When I listen when I listed in my family room 5.1 system, I rarely am hitting more than 82 dB. I mean, that's what's comfortable for my wife, unless I'm watching a concert film or watching a battle in Master and Commander again, where I just love the windows to shake with the cannon fire. The levels you listen to at home are not the movies. And even though all the movie houses do specific audio mixes just for TV, those mixes, in my opinion, are typically dialogue light. And while we have the software to measure it, show the measurements, and do a correction on the dialogue only where the dialogue is outside of a range that you set for a target, even though we can do all those things, there are not, the majority of people don't use that. There are some large studios and houses that do those remixes, which use our tools. And you tell almost immediately if you're listening on a 5.1 system, if the dialogue has been, if that has been correctly moved to a given level. That's easy. And now the thing is, on TV, you can switch between, your local network affiliate and Netflix. It's, it's not like a dial anymore. It's not even an AM and FM button anymore. There's, really a menu on the TV, and you just can go from one to the next. It's not hard to hear those differences.
Ken, is there any comparable, and I'm embarrassed to admit I don't know the answer to this, any comparable regulation for radio? And we traditionally think of analog radio, but on the HD side.
So there's not, and the reason is that the main radio channel is analog, and there's no way to do a dial. There's no way to have that level of control in radio. And the digital channels are additional channels and voluntary channels. And so what most people are doing are matching the analog channel to the digital channel, or I should say it the other way around. Whatever processing you use one, because you want that identity. You want that unity of those two things. And so digital there takes no advantage of the noise floor, and it takes no advantage of the dynamic range. Instead, the analog, which is pushed up against a limiter, hard up against a limiter, so that there's very little peak to average. Basically, they take this very wide open digital channel. When I say wide open, very dynamic, potentially dynamic, and high fidelity channel, and they just slam it into the same analog, maybe digitally based, but it's the analog necessity. It's the processor that's necessitated by frequency modulation. You cannot go above that, we'll stretch it and say 105%, but you could take that upper 5 or 10% and just have the limiter up there and compress right up to that 10% mark. So everything is loud all the time. And that's why there isn't one. There is a standard for over the top. There is a standard, there's a recommendation, a recommended standard. There's actually two. There's a whole group of people fighting for, actually some fighting for a level of 16 dB below full scale, 18 dB below full scale, and a full 24 dB below full scale for people who are delivering radio stations or anybody who's delivering audio like in radio stations, stuff that you do with streaming. But there's no regulation there at all. Doing that well costs a little bit of money. So typically you're finding what you can afford processing, pushing stuff. I mean, I find the stuff that I get over the top as audio only is all over the road. It's not even. I can compare Hulu, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Prime, and I will tell you that all of them are trying. Some of them even have published standards that you can find online. It would be called Content Delivery Standards 4. So it would be Netflix Content Delivery Standards or HBO's Content Delivery Standards. Most people make that available because if they go out and they want you to produce, if you pitch a story to them and they want you to produce, whether it's a special or a 30-minute thing or a series, you have to have that guideline. And that guideline includes how you deliver video, all of the video specifications and the audio specifications. So those, if you're curious, those are not difficult or not impossible to find. Some of the stuff is a little difficult because they tend to think it's somehow proprietary. God forbid HBO knew what Netflix wanted to do, but everybody's realizing that everybody wants to get to the same place, which is everybody wants their viewers to hang in there. Nobody wants to drive people away because the audio is bad.
All right, thanks, Chris, to you. I just saw in the chat room that Chris has another event to go to, so Chris, take